My name is Charley Fox, flight lieutenant in the RCAF. Served from 1940 to 1945. Took training, joined up in Hamilton, took training out in Brandon and Regina. Came back east again for elementary flying at Mount Hope and Dunnville, and ended up graduating from Dunnville, and myself and the chap that passed first in our course took training for an instructor at Trenton, and returned to our base of our graduation, which didn't sit well with our very straight-laced group captain, Alan Hull, who didn't think that was a good idea. And that was I graduated in the summer of 41, after having contracted scarlet fever. Put me back. I was actually with course 22 and 28, and ended up back at Dunnville in 1943, September, October, as an instructor, and remained there until 1940, that would be 41, and remained there until 43 as an instructor, May of 43, when I went to OTU at Bagotville. And then overseas in the summer of 43, took further OTU training on Spitfires in England, and finally posted to 412 Squadron in January of 1944, just before things really started to happen. I was fairly active once we got going in Europe, because we did cover D-Day, and moved across to the continent on D-Day plus 12, moving to Beny-sur-Mer, which was B4, and we were involved there with the flying out of there for the Valley Gap, moved up to Carperquet near Caen, and on up all the way through, and I was fortunate that in my sojourn with 412 Squadron, a lot of activities, putting in a lot of hours and op times, and had a ringside view of everything that was happening, because we were part of 2nd TAF, 2nd Tactical Air Force, and so we had to be aware and made aware of where the front lines were, what was happening, and moved on up through Belgium, Holland, and ended up in Germany when they moved. Well, actually, I finished my tour in January of 45, just prior to the big offensive crossing into Germany. I had a non-op tour for about 6 weeks as a test pilot on Spitfires with 410 RNSU, that's where Repair and Service Unit, where they picked up downed Spitfires, took the good parts, put them together, and then I flew that plane, and when it was right, I took it and delivered it to one of the Spitfire wings in the area. I wangled up my way back onto 126 wing as an intelligence officer, and 126 wing was special. Group Captain Gordon McGregor was our CO prior to D-Day in Normandy, and he was quite the man. He'd served with number 1 Squadron, 401 Squadron, won the D.F.C. in the Battle of Britain, still liked to get out on ops, and now he would be a man in his early 40s at this time, but periodically he would get hold of me and said, let you and I go flying. We go on a test trip or test flight to Spitfires, but we always went across the lines looking for some action. I don't know whether or not head office or 2nd TAF would have approved, but that was Gordon McGregor, quite a man and a real gentleman at the same time. As I say, I was quite active. My forte, if you will, was I managed to shoot up a fair number of trains and disable them. I might call me a train buster. I missed a lot of the real activities in the air as far as the main battles were concerned with aircraft, although I did get mixed up with a few. But I found that I could pick up a lot of activities on the ground, and so I did manage to get what they called MT, mechanical transport, and put my mark there, I suppose. And for that, I was awarded the D.F.C. in bar December of 44, and then the bar to it in February of 45. But that's a basic, concise history of my, quick history of my background with the Air Force. Coming back after the war, and then I got reactivated, if you will, and interested in flying by joining the Reserve Squadron in London, 420 Squadron, on the team that won the McBride Award, which pleased me after some years, which was the shooting contest, and our 420 Squadron won it, which pleased me to no end. That's basically a very quick history about my background in the Air Force.
November the 11th, Remembrance Day. A time to remember. A man with many memories of a particular battle gone by, namely the Second World War, is Flight Lieutenant Charley Fox, Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar. Charley, you spent 5 years in the RCAF in World War II from October of 1940 to October of 1945. The memories over those past 50-some years are golden. Some of them have remained with you for a lot of years, and some of them, I'm sure, bring joy and, at the same time, some degree of sadness. The memories of people nowadays, especially the younger generation, they have no concept of what happened, what went into the training, and the actual activity of that particular conflict. It's something that you, I know, like to share with people.
Yes, that's true. And actually, you mentioned about training. One of the first things that I had to do when I went back to Dunnville as an instructor, hadn't been on the station long, until two of the instructors going up in instructors flying weather, which was when it was under 500 feet, Normie, Kirk, and Jim McIntyre. Jim McIntyre came from my hometown of Guelph, just 2 blocks away from where we lived for a while. We went to the same school. And they took off, and unfortunately, whether they did something, they went into the river and crashed right after takeoff. I was appointed as the investigating officer, as a young flying officer, pilot officer at that time, just arrived on the station. And I had to go to the morgue. The funeral director said, "Things aren't too nice in here. Do you think you can handle it?" I said, "Well, I'm supposed to. I have to identify the bodies and take off any personal effects," which I did, and it was not a pleasant experience for a young pilot and an instructor. I had, from that, there was a smell of gas and oil and water. I identified the bodies, but that odor stayed with me for years. Strangely enough, I would say that my life was saved on 5 different occasions. On a certain time, I would get this odor, and it would bring me to very sharp alertness, and, as I say, saved my life. And the final one, strangely enough, was in the 50s, where I was returning from work, coming up over the brow of the hill at fair speed. I got this odor, took my foot off the accelerator, headed on the brakes, and just as I came over the crest of the hill, there was a tractor, a farmer's tractor, just down there. If I hadn't have done that, I would have crashed into it for sure. And that was in the 50s. So memories, yes, and not pleasant memories in that case, but there was a memory that stayed with me for years, and who's to know just why. But I remember Normie, Kirk, and Jim McIntyre on November the 11th.
Charley, you were involved, one of many players involved in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was based here in Canada and involved training pilots, Commonwealth pilots, for flight, and eventually leading them, many of them, most of them for that matter, into a conflict or battle in the Second World War. Your early years in the Air Force were spent along that line in various stations here in Canada, including Dunnville and Bagotville. Then it was your turn. You got the call to go overseas.
Yes, actually, the way it worked, they took a lot of the pilots graduating early on in order to stock the various stations opening up to act as instructors. In some cases, some of the instructors never did get out of the instructing end of it. You put your name in, and if you insisted, and you had to a certain degree, you would get later on a chance to serve. A lot of fellows didn't. And in many ways, you were risking your life just as much in the air training plan. And that's where we come back to Norm McKirk and Jim McIntyre. There's a lot of others that did lose their lives with students because the students did something wrong. And they really haven't been recognized that much. But truly, I was fortunate in that I did go on and proceed overseas in 1943.
But even before you went overseas, and you spoke of mishaps that do happen involved in the training program, you yourself came very close.
Oh, well, yes, I did, but that was in that was when I was doing the training up in Dunville, up in Bagotville, where I had a mid-air collision out on maneuvers with two other Harvards. I was leading the Harvards, and 3 Hurricanes under the leadership of Pilot Officer Buckley, an American. We weren't to mix the 2 different aircraft because of the difference in speed. He did spot us, and I noticed his wing dipped down, and they did a simulated attack on us. I didn't want to be caught napping, and so I called a break to port to let him know that I had seen them. He went down in a dive down below us and pulled up, evidently fairly sharply, and whether he blacked out or what, but he came up directly underneath my Harvard and hit dead center along my fuselage so that his left wing, which is on the Hurricane, is quite thick, I would say 16, 18 inches thick, tore it off, tore the left tailplane off, and then he spun in. His motor of his Hurricane hit my motor in the Harvard and tore it out. Everything in front of the firewall in front of me. I was alone, fortunately, in the front seat of the Harvard. And temporarily knocked me out. I came to, realized that the plane was fluttering around, wouldn't fly. The center of balance, of course, was all out of whack. Decided I had to bail out, which I did at about 3,000 feet and came down in the forest. I did manage to land safely. I got banged up a little bit, but I was the first one that got alive out of the forest up in northern Quebec at that time, and they patched me up, and I did get back into flying after about 20 days or 21 days. I got back to flying, and eventually completed my course there at Operational Training Unit, and then proceeded overseas in August of 43.
You mentioned that not necessarily all of the instructors who were involved in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan necessarily went overseas. You did. Was that desire there? Did you want to go over and see actual combat action or be involved on the front lines?
Well, I think I was mentioning before that my father was Imperial Army, had served during the Boer War, all through the Boer War. And in our family, that was given that you were going to serve your country. My brother had joined up in the Army in spring of 1940, and as I did, put mine into the Air Force. He joined the Army. Took a while for me to get in. He went overseas in the spring of 41, so he'd been overseas already by 43 for 2 years. And it was just expected that I would go over and do my bit in that particular area. I think I was a fairly good instructor in that particular aspect of it. I know that students of mine did go on and do fairly well, and perhaps I did impart to them part of the love of flying, part of the right things to do when things went wrong, and that was of strength that went over later on in the service, in our service in the Air Force. It stood us in good stead because the mechanics of flying was second nature, and you could look around, you could, everything else did. And if you got into trouble, you knew what to do to save yourself, and it came in very, very handy later on.
Remembrance Day 1994 takes on special meaning this year, Charlie, as you well know, this previous June having been the 50th anniversary of D-Day. June the 6th, 1944, where was then Flight Officer Charley Fox?
I was at Tangmere on the south coast of England, part of the covering forces, if you will. I was part of 127 Wing. Our planes 2 days before had been painted with the very distinctive black and white striping around the wing roots. We had been confined to camp. It was put off by 1 day, and we were finally briefed on the night of June the 5th at about 10 o'clock that tomorrow they were on their way, they were leaving very shortly, and we would be covering the initial invasion. I think we got to bed after that briefing at about 12:30 or 1 o'clock. I was not on the first flight from our squadron, 412 Squadron, Spitfire Squadron, but I went along as a spare in case somebody had to return. So I did. They called us at 4:30 in order to have breakfast. We were up at first light before it was still dark on the ground. We got up, and of course you could see the dawn coming as you got up higher in the air. And we went across, and the channel was just covered with ships. A solid, just almost you could walk across, solid with shipping. And we went across the coast, but by then I'm the spare, so I had to turn back. But I did get up, and I flew 2 more trips that day. The final one in the evening, and arrived back at Tangmere and had to land by lights. It was about 11 o'clock at night, so it was a long day.
That was June the 6th, 1944. Do you recall, and I know that you do have your flight log book with you that from the Second World War, do you recall November the 11th, 1944?
November the 11th, 1944, our squadron had returned to England. Actually, it was the first break that we'd had in, well, we went over on D-Day plus 12. We had 1 day off. And then what they started to do was rotate the squadrons back to England. It was really for a rest, and it was a dive bombing and air firing session at Warmel in Wales. And that's where we were on November the 11th, doing our air firing and dive bombing, simulated with smoke bombs, and just basically relaxing, although even there's one trip where I took off, had engine trouble, and had to land back on base. But that's where we were. We were back in Wales on November the 11th. Now, I don't remember that we had anything really special, but that's where we were. Sort of in a rest mode for about 1 week that we had at that time before we went back to the continent. And actually we were flying at that time. We're up into Holland, of course, at Bokel, which was just near Nijmegen. And prior to that, we had covered the Nijmegen Bridge when they tried to take it and cut the war short. And that was a very, very active time. And then we were at base there. So that's where we went back and came back to.
Here we are 50 years later, November the 11th, 1994, Charlie. What will Flight Lieutenant Charley Fox, D.F.C, be doing on this date?
Actually, I will be remembering, and prior to it, actually, I'm going to be doing 2 things prior to it. Last year I did it, and it made an impression, I hope, on some young people. I spoke to a couple of schools, and one my daughter taught at, and I spoke to 3 different classes with 100 children in each. Came in, and then another, I spoke to a group down in St. Thomas, and gave them some of the memories of some of the people that I remembered, which I do, certain ones every November the 11th. At the same time, at our church, one thing that we've been doing for some time, for the past 5 years, is have a church parade with our scouting group, which includes, of course, the Girl Guides, Brownies, and so on. And we try to bring forward and let them know what the November the 11th means. And part of it is very effective because we have a white foam cross that we lean against the altar. Now, it so happens that this is in an Anglican church that I'm involved with, St. Barnabas in London, and we have the children bring up, each one is given a poppy to pin on, and it has various wars, various actions taken that they are pinning on as we remember, and they know that here is something, and it can be, could be Dieppe, can be Normandy, D-Day, or any other. And I think when I speak to them, I try to remember one or two of the people that I knew personally who were killed on action and not with us today. And I think that this year I will be doing the same thing. On the day itself, of course, I will have the 2-minute silence. I will be speaking to the Rotarians up in Kitchener. Here again, I will be remembering certain people on that. And that's what I do each November the 11th. This November the 11th, 1994, I have one or two very special people that I will be thinking of.
Can you share those with us now?
Yes, I'd like to share one with you if I may, because it was a year ago that I was with them. And hard to believe that Jim Buchanan, who I knew from Dunville days as an instructor, after all these years I find out just what type of man this Jim Buchanan was. He was an American, an aeronautical engineer who joined the RAF and went over to England and helped develop ways of de-icing wings of an aircraft. I never knew this until I read Jim's obituary, because Jim was at an Allied Air Services reunion in Toronto. I had lunch with him on the Sunday. The following Sunday, he had died in Florida of an aneurysm. And this is what happened to Jim Buchanan. He was invalided out of the RAF, went back to the States, came up to Canada, joined the RCF, ended up an instructor, a sergeant pilot instructor at Dunville. That's where I met him and knew him. And later on, after the war was over, he didn't get over to, because of his injuries, which I did not know about while I knew him in Dunville. Later on, at our reunion that we've had every year since 1946 at Dunville, he started coming up from Maryland in 1952. Well-to-do, because he was driving a Jag, which was really something at that time. And always he was there every year. And he had his own personality. And as I say, Jim and I hit it off. We had our differences at times, arguments about this, that, and the other thing. But Jim Buchanan was involved with people around the world through his work with the Rotarians. He, wherever and whatever he got involved with, he always backed things up with doing something. He had more ideas, and this year in particular, after finding out, and I didn't know last year at this time, I found out that he had died suddenly, but then this came after November the 11th, and I got his obituary telling all that he had done for Rotary and around the world, and what he had actually done through wartime and instructing, and yet a very quiet man. He never let us know about this, and I felt that I knew him pretty well, and so you look back on, he made a difference, and this is something that a lot of other people perhaps can look on what Jim Buchanan did in his way and passed on in the instructing part, but prior to that he had already done his bit, if you will, with the RAF, and so I will remember Jim Buchanan particularly on this November the 11th.
There are many good memories, along with the sad and the heart-wrenching that come from a conflict. And Charley, I know the one memory that you have is when you returned home, and your wife had a surprise for you, and something that you had not seen before.
Well, yes, actually, when I had my mid-air collision and my head was banged up a bit, and my wife was pregnant at the time, and I called Guelph, my hometown, and talked to her uncle, who was her doctor, and wondered if it would be all right if I did come home. Would the sight of me cause any problems? He said, oh, no, not at all. And then when I finished at operational training unit and left to go overseas, my wife was 6 months pregnant at the time, and while I was overseas, our son Jimmy was born on November the 10th, 1943. When I came home in the late summer, or actually August of 45, my wife met me, Helen met me in Toronto. We spent a couple of days there. Went back to Guelph by train. I was met on this train station by people from the Legion and what have you, and Mother and Dad. My younger brother, whom I didn't really recognize, he'd grown so much, sprouted up to taller than I was, from being fat and roly-poly to a big, actually a man of 6 foot, over 6 feet. And then we rode up to where my wife was living with her mother on the second floor apartment of a home owned by her uncle and her aunt. And I go into the side door entrance and the steps leading up to the second floor. Ha! See a little boy up there, curly-headed, my son. And his mother says, Jimmy, there's your daddy. You've got to give him a kiss. My son turned from the baluster up at the top of the steps, ran into the bedroom, got my picture, and brought it and gave my picture a kiss, because this is what he did every night. Yeah, I remember.
Charley, one final question as we head into this Remembrance Day, 1994. What kind of message do you have for Canadians, especially younger generations, when it comes to this special day?
Actually, on November the 11th, for the young people, and prior to it, perhaps a week prior to it, this goes to teachers and what have you, it would be worthwhile to take a look at that time in history of what happened, how it happened with the Hitler, with the Holocaust, and everything that, and it happens, really, you look at the whole thing starting in the 30s and the 40s and why it happened. And I think you have to be prepared, and to the young people, whether it's in your everyday life and what you're involved with, there comes a time where you have to take a stand and stand up and be counted. This comes into discipline and taking this responsibility on yourself. And I think that is the message to the young people. Take a look at what happened, read about it, understand what sacrifices were made on your behalf and how it happened. And one case in point I can make, which taking in flying, Jimmy Doolittle, in flying the Mitchell and being part of that attack on Tokyo. There were 16 or 17 fellows that took off of an aircraft carrier flying a twin-engine plane that was not built to fly from aircraft carriers, heavily loaded with bombs, all the fuel that they could get. And they knew that it was a one-way mission. They were going to be attacking to show or wave the flag, if you will, for their country, and they knew that they could not come back safely to where they took off, and they were going to have to crash land or land someplace in China. They looked at being killed, taken prisoner, and perhaps being taken in and looked after by a people they did not know, and they did it. This is commitment, but also there are many things like that that took part during the Second World War, and you have to take a stand. So I say to all young people, read the stories that come out of that war, learn from them, and be ready to take your place, if necessary, in history. But really, if you take your stand, you should not have to go through the possibility that they talk about of a third world war.
Charley Fox, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts and your memories.
My pleasure. I hope that on November the 11th that we do bow our heads in reverence, and I will with many memories. Thank you.